Hey, it's Dr. Mitch Earlywine here for our hallucinogens lecture. I'm sorry to say I am stuffed up beyond repair. I just want to emphasize that we want to take it easy on this topic. I do have a couple of disclaimers to offer about both therapeutic and religious use of hallucinogens. We are going to touch on some potential treatment effects of the hallucinogens. I'm not recommending the home game. Okay, this is far and away the drug that is most sensitive to set and setting. The expectation and the environment are really critical. And I do touch on some religious topics on this one. I don't mean to insult anybody's religion or make anybody question their atheism. Just trying to stick to the data here. Yes, please feel free to post a question or email me if somehow the therapeutic or religious parts are upsetting you. There's no need to freak out. I promise I have nothing but good in my heart about all of these. So let's just touch on the chapter objectives here. We're going to talk about the classification of hallucinogens. Bottom line, in part because we just don't know what else to do, we're going to focus on different neurotransmitters that are sort of predominant and divide them up that way. I'm going to get a little bit into the history of LSD in part because it's one of the hallucinogens we seem to know quite a bit about. I want to talk about some of the myths and facts about that hallucinogen in particular. We're going to make sure we cover some of the other particularly popular ones. So the special dangers of MDMA, PCP, and ketamine. I, again, don't want to be alarmist, but just want to emphasize that these aren't toys. Despite the evidence for therapeutic effects, they are really powerful drugs at incredibly low doses and not something you want to take lightly, and truth be told, you should never take them ever. Finally, I did want to touch on Salvia divinorum, which is a novel one and certainly an interesting one, and is sometimes in the news lately, although it's right now pales in comparison of the opiate epidemic. So, I want to touch about old Albert Hoffman. So, if you could imagine being back in the 40s during World War II in Switzerland, Albert Hoffman is working for a big drug company and he's really trying to find a drug that's going to help pregnant women not lose blood during delivery, okay? So Albert Hoffman's trying to help mommies and babies, all right? It's not that he was trying to find some way to trip the world. He was doing some research on ergot, this fungus, and we'll get into some of that. He had a number of different extracts from it, including one that was LSD 25, lysergic acid diethylamide 25, and thought he had absorbed it transdermally, but actually probably must have ingested it somehow. And let's just talk about it. So, yeah, it was in the 1940s, so middle of World War II. He was unaware of minute traces of LSD from the lab and had his first acid trip. Basically, he was trying to ride his bicycle home after he noticed some cognitive distortions and odd experiences and alterations in consciousness. And the bicycle ride became kind of a legend. So he conducted the first experiment, basically went back to the lab, but the next day and dosed up again. And they're, big documentaries, they're fun books about this. And it's curious that folks have really caught into the spirit of this and made a big deal out of it. But trying to describe the experience is a bit like, I don't know, creating a piece of cloth that will explain what a symphony is or something. It's rather confusing. But that notion is actually part of the issue, is that there is this strange intermingling of visual and auditory sensations that he noticed. So it was as if he saw colors, and he also noticed visual images when he closed his eyes, and was basically the first one to document this with this drug. Defining LSD really, it's the incarnation of the word ineffable, and so in a sense, the hard work that's gone into measuring the subjective effects has proven almost comical to folks who are accustomed to using it. But so the term we've used in the literature includes psychedelic, which means mind expanding. Other folks said entheogenic, generating the divine within, which is sort of neat. You know the word Genesis, that's the genic part. And theo is a deity. We have psychotomimetic, having the appearance of a psychosis. When I lived in a halfway house in grad school with schizophrenics who'd had psychotic experiences, but who'd also done LSD, they said, no, this is not a reasonable parallel, in part because when you do acid, you know you've done acid. And they have auditory hallucinations where they really do genuinely hear voices that sound like they're a lot like their own thoughts, but seem to be coming from elsewhere. That's not quite getting at the LSD experience. Psychodysleptic, nobody says that. And finally, psycholytic, mind dissolving, which was kind of trendy in the psychiatric literature for a little while. But if you know psychedelic, psychotomimetic, and entheogenic, you'll be far on your way to doing fine on the exam. So to classify them, unfortunately, it's a hell of a taxonometric problem. How do we divide these things up if they all sort of have comparable effects, or are we going to draw subtle distinctions between effects? It just doesn't lend itself to easy, reliable classification. So first and foremost, we thought, well, what if we classify them by their effects on the users? It's a nice idea, and it certainly gets the whole category classified well. So certainly things that have these odd alterations in consciousness attributable to these chemicals make sense. But we had to kind of boil it down and basically say, okay, well, what neurotransmitter system is sort of first and foremost in their activities? And generally, we're going to focus on 3 neurotransmitter systems: serotonin, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine. I'm not saying they only work in these systems. I'm just saying this is sort of the take-home message for how we divide them up. So let's take a look at the classifications. First and foremost, we've got the serotonergic ones, and these are in many ways the classic hallucinogens: LSD, psilocybin, morning glory seeds, DMT, and harmine. So LSD is also known as acid. You've probably heard of it. Psilocybin, call it out, was that often found in, of course, the fungi, mushroom species. Morning glory seeds do not get a lot of play anymore, but they do have hallucinogenic properties. If you buy morning glory seeds in the store now, they often have toxins put in them to keep them from being used in this way. You'd have to grow the plant and then harvest the seeds yourselves. It's essentially difficult to figure out how to dose it. It's just not something that's worth the effort. DMT and harmine are both in ayahuasca, the tea used by the Santo Daime Church, and we'll talk about that in more detail later. But basically, these are all primarily in that serotonin system. In contrast to hallucinogens, they say chemically similar to norepinephrine, and it's not like the molecules look exactly alike or anything, but they seem to involve this system in their primary modes of action. So that includes mescaline, which we see in peyote or the San Pedro cactus; Dom, which actually I don't hear much about anymore; MDMA, the ecstasy; and then MDA, which was sort of the precursor to ecstasy that was big in the 80s, had some of the same stimulating effects and thought disorder, but not the same empathogen effects that MDMA is so notorious for. That same I love everybody and want to marry them all right now. And the third category, we're going to talk about the cholinergic ones. These work in the acetylcholine system. So atropine, we alluded to in that first lecture on classes and categories. This is a hallucinogen at higher doses. It's a key ingredient in belladonna, so when it's administered directly to the eye, you see that giant increase in the size of the pupil. Scopolamine, which is actually used as a motion sickness drug in some countries. It's transdermally administered that way. Um, curious set of decisions. Hyoscyamine, which obviously we don't see too often, and ibotenic acid, which is actually being experimented with for some therapeutic uses. We'll get into that. But these, just if you could recognize them as cholinergic, you'll be in great shape. And finally, the platypi. We sort of have these ones that are chemically unlike any neurotransmitter, and we don't know exactly what to do with them. PCP, which is basically a dissociative anesthetic. You sort of feel out of your body, and if not feeling pain, at least ambivalent about the fact that it hurts. Ketamine, the same deal. My older daughter was administered this when she had a little accident at just age 3. It does have some potential euphoric effects. It doesn't necessarily target any of these classic neurotransmitter systems. And then Salvia divinorum, the leaves that are used by the shamans in Oaxaca, that they're usually chewed by a shaman who will then sort of tell you some Barnum statements or some insights into your life. But Americans, we had to extract it all and smoke it to make it basically make you act like an idiot. Well, let's get into LSD as sort of a classic model. So, lysergic acid diethylamide. Okay, please do know the full name, not just the letters. It is the most widely known hallucinogen, although some other ones are certainly creeping up on it now as MDMA is getting more popular, particularly with its therapeutic use. And it was synthetically derived from the ergot fungus. So ergot is basically a mold that grows on rye. And there's been some conjecture that it may have been involved in the Salem witch trials. The folks who all were the accusers of the witches back then lived on the sort of western side of the town, all seemed to use the same place to store their rye. It had been a very wet season for rye, and then all the bewitched notions kind of fell apart the following year when it was markedly drier. I mean, if you think about it, if you came over to my house and sat down and said, hey, let's have some rye bread, and we ate it, and then you just started tripping balls, you'd say, Mitch is a witch, right? I mean, they're doing the best they can to try to explain what's going on. Truth be told, there's a lot of potential underlying racist issues. Tituba, who was a slave who was not Caucasian, seemed to get accused. Tons of foreign wars going on at the time. It was really stressful. Let's be honest. I mean, for a few years in the U.S., we're not an easy time. 1600s, a lot of bad stuff happened that was way out of our control. We didn't even understand germs. So people were doing the best they could, but things really got out of control. Ergot may have contributed, but hardly was the source of all the insanity about it. It's kind of ironic that in South America at the same time, people were coming across hallucinogenic substances and turning it into a religious ritual that was uniting people. So it does say something about the interaction with culture. So Hoffman basically was, again, trying to reduce bleeding and contraction. So ergot tends to decrease peripheral blood flow. Your capillaries are going to constrict so that there's less blood. Obviously, you lose less under those circumstances, so it would be a potential to treat some childbirth problems. It was the 25th variation of all the extracts he had made from that ergot. He put it up on the shelf for quite some time and then went back to it in curious ways. People have decided that, he was waiting for the universe to need it most. I obviously don't know how to test that thing empirically, but it was a wild notion. There are intriguing documentaries about him all over YouTube. It's also, the middle of World War II when everybody was really struggling for a number of other reasons. So what are the acute effects? Again, very hard to describe. We want to keep in mind that this is the most powerful psychoactive drug. This is a drug that is psychoactive in micrograms, right? In millionths of a gram, 100 millionths of a gram would trip folks really hard. Most of the Human Drug Administration studies on this that were done literally decades ago did maybe 200 micrograms. Occasionally, street acid apparently has up to 500 micrograms, which would have to be a rather startling dosage. Orally absorbed into blood and brain, it definitely does cross that blood-brain barrier, as we've discussed before. Effects begin after 30 to 60 minutes, but often they're rather modest at first. Peaks at 90 minutes, and again, there's a lot of variation around this. Generally, the subjective effects are going to come in waves, shall we say, so it's hard to measure these objectively. And the half-life is 3 hours, so 50% diminished in the sense that it's been absorbed. But we're talking about, again, a drug that is psychoactive in micrograms, so you're trying to find millionths of a gram. It's not an easy feat. After 5 to 12 hours, the LSD effects are over. Nah, not exactly. Unfortunately, particularly at higher doses, you're going to see subjective experiences, trips, if you will, out in hour 14, and it's unfortunate because the cognitive distortions remain, and this is when people are sitting around going, oh my God, I'm never coming back, right? Or whatever you heard about it preceding schizophrenia is going to haunt you. It's not that the effects are over, it's that the subjective changes that are more flagrant are gone, and now you are completely exhausted. So yes, we do see euphoria and restlessness. Laughing or crying, raised body temperature, elevated blood pressure, increased heart rate, dilated pupils. Well, when we were talking about the sympathetic nervous system, these are classic stimulant type effects. I would say the euphoria and the laughing or crying seem really strange, but what we're talking about essentially is alterations in cognition. If you buy the cognitive behavioral model, it's our thoughts that really contribute to our affect, our mood, our emotions, and as those thoughts change, particularly if you take your thoughts seriously, then lo and behold, you're either going to be euphoric or absolutely despondent and oddly connected, oddly novel. It's really, really hard to second guess the emotional experience because it is obviously linked to cognitions, which are obviously linked to set and setting. So if you go in frightened and you're the only one tripping and you're around a bunch of white men in lab coats, it's not going to be a pleasant time. If you happen to be in a delightfully safe place around your pals and the phone is turned off and you've got toys and food and fun things to play with, it might be a dramatically different experience. But again, never do it. So what is the trip? Well, there are 4 distinctive features. Again, we're talking about describing the ineffable here. This seems inane to try to put this into words, but one hallmark is that synesthesia I alluded to earlier, so an intermingling of the senses. I remember one of the 1970s shows that tried to depict this. A woman who had it slipped on her said, I see music, I see music. It's not quite it. It's maybe that she thought she understood the waveforms of music and that they were also light, and she was acknowledging the fact that she was having some visual experiences that went along with the music, right? Subjective touches were rough or smooth, just as in our language, rough words are smooth words. It's all connected, okay? So it's not classic synesthesia. Now, there are neurological problems that lead to synesthesia. Case study of a guy who said every time he ate roast beef, he felt cold metal on his arms and things like that. It's not like that, but just so you understand the term, I will most likely put that on the test. The perception of a multi-level reality. Well, that's intuitively obvious. Now, the notion that in a way we've got our everyday quotidian stuff, but that above and beyond all that is, if not a master plan, at least a master functioning. And somehow below that, at the molecular level, are atoms and molecules dancing around, interacting with each other, who might just be enjoying that process if we would only appreciate it. All right, so see how that sort of multi-level thing works? No, you don't. I'm sorry. Doing the best we can here. So the swings in emotion or feelings of panic, obviously as the cognitions change, so do the emotions. So if you do whip yourself into a frenzy, you are going to panic, but what a surprise. Just remember that it's all connected. And then you might have a swing in emotion to a much more relaxed way. And then a feeling of timelessness. So in fact, items on the mystical experiences questionnaire or some of the other subjective measures of this emphasize that it seems like time is standing still, or really now is eternal. We only have right now. Seen folks go off on this notion that time and space are really the same because we don't know how to measure time except by where the earth is in relation to the sun, right? So really time is just where the earth has moved, so it's space. Anyway, you see how trippy it gets. Bottom line is we got synesthesia, multi-level reality, alterations in affect, a feeling of timelessness. These are sort of hallmarks of it. Just be able to recognize those if you saw them. And then we're going to make the transition to psilocybin here. I feel like, this is another one where it's relatively well known. It does have therapeutic effects that are worth getting into. The mushrooms grew primarily in southern Mexico and Central America, at least the cubensis, the fungi species that's probably the most common. The Aztecs called it Tiananacaltl, which apparently means God's flesh. Depending upon whom you ask, it was either reserved for the royalty and even then only used at particular times. Other tribes might have had all the males do it, but maybe only once in their lives, much like the sort of Vision Quest model. But needless to say, they certainly were well known in South America and some of Central America. Similar to LSD, well, the duration is probably not comparable. So half-life is shorter. Trips of, say, 6 hours after an experience are much more common. Obviously, again, it's not micrograms, probably 1.5 grams to 2 grams is a classic dose of mushrooms themselves. Psilocybin, the extract, very different. And then it's disconnected from its plant base. So, my friends who are shamans basically would say that's a ridiculous idea. You don't want to separate it from the mushroom itself because there are other chemicals in there. And our, monotheistic worship of, find the single molecule is probably not a great idea. There are probably other molecules that are related to it that contribute to the experience. And there definitely is cross-tolerance in the sense that those who have experienced LSD seem to show some tolerance to psilocybin and vice versa. And even the rodent work suggests this is the case. I can talk about how that's done, but basically you train a rat to press one bar if he or she is feeling psilocybin, another bar if they're having just like a stimulant effect or something like that. But clearly we do have evidence that these do show some cross-tolerance, although not a ton. And in fact, the hallucinogens themselves do not show a ton of cross-tolerance or tolerance except for MDMA, which we'll get into later. All right, well, we're about long enough to go ahead and take a break. I'm going to pick it up on psilocybin. Make sure you get your 5 minutes to rest your head, write out some questions, make sure you're taking your notes, and we'll pick it up in hallucinogens 2.